Hello, welcome to Church History Insights and Questions. My name is David Eaton. This is the 8th episode and it's on plural marriage. Plural marriage is a very big subject. We won't be able to cover every minute detail of it. If you have any follow-up questions, put them in the comments below or send them on an email to CHIQ1830@gmail.com. So were there any revelations regarding plural marriage? Joseph Bates Noble, who later married Joseph Smith to Louisa Beeman in the first plural marriage that took place in Nauvoo, said that the doctrine of celestial marriage was revealed to Joseph Smith while he was engaged on the work of translation of the scriptures, meaning Smith's inspired revision of the Bible. Historian Daniel Bachman suggests that this occurred in February 1831. Reading about the patriarchs, especially given Smith's interest in Abraham, was a likely reason for him to begin thinking about plural marriage, a valid Christian primitivist doctrine. Perhaps it was inevitable that the Semitic custom be restored in a church that believed it was restoring all important ancient biblical revelation and practice. The importance polygamy was given in Mormonism is surprising, however. Smith and other 19th century Mormons taught that plural marriage was necessary for complete salvation, while such a theological connection is never made in the Old Testament, close quote. That quote comes from Todd Compton's book called In Sacred Loneliness, The Plural Wives of Joseph Smith. It was written in 1997. There'll be a few quotations from Todd Compton through this short presentation. So continuing, were there any revelations? Another reference to revelation, Apostle Lyman Johnson, who was the brother of one of Smith's plural wives, Marinda Johnson Hyde, told Apostle Orson Pratt that Joseph had made known to him as early as 1831 that plural marriage was a correct principle, but the time had not yet come to teach and practice it. Smith was living in the Johnson household while making his revision of the Old Testament, so Lyman's testimony is valuable. And then two revelations that are in writing. On the 27th of July, 1842, Joseph Smith dictated a revelation for Newell K. Whitney in Nauvoo, Illinois, which provided instructions for Whitney to use in performing the sealing of his daughter, Sarah Ann Whitney, to Joseph Smith that same day. Joseph Smith's 27th of July revelation represents the only extant instructions from Joseph Smith's lifetime for conducting a plural marriage. It wasn't canonized, and this information comes from the Joseph Smith papers. The second revelation, which was canonized, is the one that we're all more familiar with, as it now appears in section 132 of the Doctrine and Covenants. Joseph Smith dictated a revelation on the 12th of July, 1843, in Nauvoo, Illinois, on eternal and plural marriage. Since the mid-1830s, Joseph Smith had evidently been teaching some monogamous Latter-day Saint couples that their unions would endure into eternity if they remained faithful. As I say, this is canonized Actually not until 1876, much later, and it's now section 132 of the Doctrine and Covenants. The story behind this is quite interesting in that Emma Smith, Joseph Smith's first wife, was in and out of plural marriage favour. There were times when she was open to the idea, but then there were other times when she was hostile to the idea. And she was in a hostile mode in 1843 in July, and Hiram Smith, Joseph's brother, comes to Joseph and says, get a revelation or write a revelation on the subject, and I will take it to Emma and I will show it to her, and she will be persuaded that this is of God. The famous story is that Joseph says to Hiram, you do not know Emma as well as I do. I'm not sure that this is going to work in substance. That's not a direct quotation. But nevertheless, Hiram insists that it will. Joseph dictates the revelation to William Clayton, his private secretary and scribe. Hiram takes the revelation, which we now know as section 132, and he shows it to and gives it to Emma. Emma reads it, and then she says, quote, I don't believe a word of it. And she rejects the revelation. However, it remained on the books, as it were, and it was, as I say, canonized in 1876 and is now available as section 132 of the Doctrine and Covenants. A question that comes up very frequently is, how many plural wives did Joseph Smith have? I should just interject a personal reminiscence here, in that when I joined the church in 1972, Joseph Smith's plural marriage situation was not discussed at all. The missionaries and the members in the area where I joined the church in England, they all talked about plural marriage really starting with Brigham Young. And so it wasn't until many years later that I became aware that Joseph Smith was actually the one who introduced plural marriage and initiated the principle, as it was known, into Nauvoo society. So how many plural wives did Joseph Smith have is not an easy question to answer. There are lots of different lists. I found 25 different lists of his wives. The smallest list had 3 names on it, and the largest list had 78 names on it. That's an average of 28 if you look at all of the names on all of the lists. I've gone here with the list that Brian and Laura Hales have on their website. Their website is called josephsmithspolygamy.org. They are credited with being perhaps the researchers and historians that have done more work on the documentation relating to Joseph Smith's wives than perhaps anyone else. So this is 35, it could be a bit more, 40, 45, could be a bit less. We don't really know, and I don't think we'll ever know precisely the number, because we can only go for all the scholars and the historians can only go from the records that are available. But this is the list of 35 that Brian and Laura Hales have come up with. Just over halfway down on the left-hand column is Fanny Alger. Fanny Alger was the first wife, and this was around 1835, possibly 1836. and then others, and then there was a break, and Joseph Smith didn't marry other wives until 1842. Louisa Beaman being the sort of second wife in that process. 11 of Joseph Smith's wives, so from this list, were 14 to 20 years old when they married him. 9 were 21 to 30 when they married him. 8 were in Joseph Smith's own peer group, aged 31 to 40. In the age group 41 to 50, there was a big drop-off and only 2 wives feature there. And 3 are in the group 51 to 60. What kind of marriages were these? This is a good question because often when we hear of plural marriage, we kind of think of marriage as we understand it to a degree ourselves in the 20th, 21st centuries. But this isn't about courtship. This isn't about church weddings or registry offices' weddings. This isn't about large groups of friends getting together. This isn't about a big feast. And it's not about a honeymoon and so forth. And it's often not about them living together, although there were instances of that. But it's not often about that. And the Joseph Smith Papers in the introduction says, quote, reminiscent accounts suggests that Smith's plural marriage sealings can be placed in 3 categories: sealings for the couple's mortal lifetime, sealings for eternity, or sealings for both his lifetime and eternity, end quote. And Todd Compton adds, quote, the extant sources concerning plural marriage preclude a thorough understanding of the practice during this period, making it difficult to unravel its complexities, its prevalence, and the experiences of the women and men involved in these relationships. That's really an answer to the second question there. How reliable is the source information? So whenever we think about things that happened in the church history, we need to remember that scholars are relying upon the reliability of the availability of the source information that they have. Next question here is, how did Joseph Smith react to being told to practice plural marriage? One of his wives, Lucy Walker, said that when Joseph first learned about this, he, quote, he had his doubts about it, for he debated it in his own mind. Eliza R. Snow, another wife of Joseph's, said that Joseph was afraid to teach it, afraid to promulgate it. She also said, it was in a private interview with my brother, Lorenzo Snow, that the prophet Joseph unbosomed his heart and described the trying mental ordeal he experienced in overcoming the repugnance of his feelings, the natural result of the force of education and social custom, relative to the introduction of plural marriage, close quote. These are quotes from, these are direct quotes from original documentation that is all available to see on the josephsmithpapers.org website. What is this about Joseph Smith being threatened by an angel with a drawn sword? You'll probably have heard of this story. It's not that the accounts of the people that we'll look at in just a moment, it's not as if they were there and they saw the angel and the drawn sword, but these are third-hand accounts or second-hand accounts of people that Joseph Smith spoke to about these visits from the angel. And Joseph Smith said to many people that the angel visited him and threatened him that if he did not introduce plural marriage as he had been commanded to, then he would in fact be destroyed. and he would have to be replaced with another. So the Brian Hales, again, is the one who's done most of the analysing the angel sword accounts. In all, 20 accounts from 9 witnesses have been identified. The earliest in 1853 was from Joseph Lee Robinson. Lorenzo Snow, he gave 3 accounts in 1869, 1892, and 1896. Benjamin F. Johnson, who was a very good friend of Joseph Smith's, he left 6 accounts, 1869, 1896, and 1903. 4 of Joseph Smith's wives, Eliza R. Snow, Zena Huntington, Helen Mar Kimball, and Mary Elizabeth Rollins Leitner, they all left accounts, multiple accounts. You can see 4 accounts there from Mary Elizabeth Rollins Leitner. Erastus Snow and Orson Pratt make up the balance of these 9 people and the 20 accounts. Only one of the 20 accounts does not refer to a drawn sword, but the other 19 do refer to that. And this information is taken from Brian Hale's work entitled Encouraging Joseph Smith to Practice Plural Marriage, the Accounts of the Angel with a Drawn Sword. Why did Joseph Smith marry women already married? Not everybody knows this, but most people do now. Joseph Smith, so this is quoting from Joseph Smith papers again, quote, Joseph Smith was sealed to a number of women who were already married. Neither these women nor Smith explained much about these sealings, though sources suggest that some of these marriages were for eternity alone. These sealings may have been an early version of linking one family to another. We'll kind of come back to that a bit later, but that's an interesting insight there. In Nauvoo, most, if not all, of the first husbands seem to have continued to live in the same household with their wives during Smith's lifetime. And complaints from either the women or their first husband about these sealings to Joseph Smith are virtually absent from the documentary record. Close quote. How many of Joseph Smith's wives were already married? Well, again, referring to the lists provided by Brian and Laura Hales, they have identified from the records 14 of Joseph Smith's plural wives who were already married. And the table that you can see here shows their names and also the names of their legal husbands. Todd Compton adds, quote, none of these women divorced their first husbands while Smith was alive, and all of them continued to live with their civil spouses while married to Smith. And so the use of the word married there, it's probably more accurate to use the term sealed, because it wasn't married in quite the same sense that we apply the word these days. Now, how did plural marriage affect plural wives? Again, quoting from Joseph Smith papers, unlike Sarah Ann Whitney, who's one of Joseph's wives, whose sealing was arranged and who continued to live with her parents after the sealing, Eliza Snow, and she's the lady who's pictured here, Eliza Snow married Smith without her family's knowledge or approval. Snow's journal and contemporary poems suggest that she greatly admired Smith and was deeply concerned for his welfare. Years later, she related that when she was introduced to the practice of plural marriage, she found the idea repugnant. But with time, she accepted and revered it. Quote, As I increased in knowledge concerning the principle and design of plural marriage, I grew in love with it, and today esteem it a precious sacred principle. Close quote. Snow further noted that her marriage to Joseph Smith was, quote, one of the most important circumstances of my life. I never have had cause to regret, close quote. So I think we'll see as we look at, and as you read about and do more research on how it affected plural wives, I think we're going to see it's across a spectrum, as of course so much else is in life generally. You were going to find some people who initially hated it and found it repugnant, but who eventually praises it and found it to be sacred in some instances. And then we're going to find others who are at the other end of the spectrum and who hated it from the beginning and never ever got used to it or enjoyed it, and they simply suffered through it. So it's going to be on a spectrum of people's feelings and how it affected them. With Eliza R. Snow for a moment, who was sealed to Smith in June 1842, later wrote, "When I reflected that I was living in the dispensation of the fullness of times, embracing all other dispensations, surely plural marriage must necessarily be included," close quote. That's taken from Eliza R. Snow's biography, Sketch of My Life, which she wrote in 1885, obviously many years after the event with being sealed to Joseph Smith. One of Joseph Smith's plural wives, Helen Mar Kimball, remembered, quote, "The prophet said that the practice of this principle would be the hardest trial the saints would ever have to test their faith." And we'll look at that again when we come to inquire as to why plural marriage was instituted at all. And it being a trial is one of the suggested reasons put forward. Helen Mar Kimball also recalled, quote, "I did not try to conceal the fact of its having been a trial, but confessed that it had been one of the severest of my life, but that it had also proven one of the greatest of blessings. I could truly say it had done the most towards making me a saint and a free woman, in every sense of the word. And I knew many others who could say the same, and to whom it had proven one of the greatest boons, a blessing in disguise," close quote. Helen Mar Kimball was only 14 when Joseph Smith and she were sealed together. And interestingly, she is the most prolific author on the subject of all of Joseph Smith's wives. However, her experience, it would be probably a mistake to conclude that that was exactly the same as everybody's experience. These are going to be on a sort of a continuum of different experiences. Often plural wives who experienced loneliness also reported feelings of depression, despair, anxiety, helplessness, abandonment, anger, psychosomatic symptoms, and low self-esteem. Certainly, polygamous marriage was accepted by 19th century Mormons as thoroughly sacred. This is according to Todd Compton. I think it might be probably slightly clearer to say that some accepted by 19th century Mormons as thoroughly sacred, not necessarily everybody. It also defined what was most holy to them, but its practical result for the woman was solitude, close quote. This comes from In Sacred Loneliness by Todd M. Compton. This is an account that was put together. This is a book, really. It's called The Women of Mormonism, The Story of Polygamy. It was put together by Jenny Anderson Freusseth, and it was done so, or published in 1882. So she would have worked on that for probably some years prior to it. And she, in her book, she says this, quote, "A few years ago, a little band of brave and devoted women in Salt Lake City associated themselves together for the purpose of fighting an iniquitous monster which had brought thousands of their sex to untimely and unwept graves. Some of these women had experienced personally all the horrors of the Mormon system. And when an organ for the Anti-Polygamy Society was established, they were willing to give their experience to the world, only stipulating that for family and personal reasons their names should not be made public. They were willing to make private affidavits to all the facts, those affidavits to be held in reserve, should their veracity be questioned." And her book contains information from many of the wives. This is not necessarily Joseph Smith's wives, because this is much later in the process. This is Utah, and it's really moving towards the end of the practice of plural marriage. And so this is much later, but it does give insight into some of the experiences that plural wives had and how it affected them. Anne Eliza Young, author of Wife Number 19 and My Life in Bondage, two books that she wrote, to the Mormon wives of Utah, she says this, quote, "So long as God shall spare my life, I shall pray and plead for your deliverance from the worse than Egyptian bondage in which you are held. Despised, maligned, and wronged, kept in gross ignorance of the great world outside, its pure creeds, its high aims, its generous motives, you have been led to believe that the noblest nation on earth is but a horde of miscreants, and that everyone outside of your own church is your enemy and plotting your destruction." And then she goes on to say in the closing chapter of the same work, Mrs. Young makes this eloquent appeal for assistance, and the appeal is made to the women of America generally. And she says, quote, "And you, happier women, you to whom life has given of its best and crowned right royally, can you not help me? The cry of my suffering and sorrowing sisters sweeps over the broad prairies and asks you, and I ask you now, can you do nothing for us?" Women's pens and women's voices pleaded earnestly and pathetically for the abolition of slavery. Thousands of women, some of them your countrywomen and your equals in moral and intellectual worth, are held in a more revolting slavery today. The system that blights every woman's life who enters it ought not to remain a curse and a stain upon this nation any longer. It should be blotted out so completely that even its foul memory should die. Close quote. So Anne Eliza Young describes herself as wife number 19, and she's referring to Brigham Young, Brigham Young's 19th wife. Historians and scholars who've done a lot of digging and research, they actually put her at number 22 in the list of Brigham Young's wives. I think he had 55 or maybe 57 in total. And so this, as you can see, this is moving right to the other end of the spectrum of feelings. And this is a wife who clearly felt very strongly against the whole process, and in fact obtained a divorce from Brigham Young, and afterwards wrote these books that she is referring to, and she was a great advocate on the behalf of plural wives, and trying to bring an end to what she regarded as a blight upon the nation, and particularly a blight upon the lives of the women who were involved. So, as I say, in all of these things, we're going to find different views, and there'll be some who speak positively, and then others who speak very negatively about the actual experience of being a plural wife. Which brings us to the question of, well, why was this instituted at all in the first place? Why plural marriage? Going back to the work of Brian and Laura Hales, they put forward 4 reasons on the work that they have done. The first is restitution of all things. It's part of the overall restoration of the gospel. To provide, as I mentioned earlier, to provide a customized trial. Multiplying and replenishing the earth. This is actually a quote from the Revelation itself, section 132, verse 63. They, the plural wives, are given unto him, their husband, to multiply and replenish the earth, according to my commandment, that they may bear the souls of men, close quote. And making eternal marriage available to everyone. So those are the 4 put forward by the Hales. According to Mary Elizabeth Leitner, and again, this is according to Todd Compton in his book, In Sacred Loneliness. According to Mary Elizabeth Leitner, who was married to Adam Leitner, when Joseph proposed to her, Joseph said, I was his before I came here. He said, all the devils in hell should never get me from him. Elsewhere, she wrote that Smith told her he had been commanded to marry her or suffer condemnation. For I, Mary, was created for him before the foundation of the earth was laid. This is a somewhat isolated view expressed. It's not consistent throughout the historical record, but it is put forward as perhaps another reason that perhaps Joseph Smith appeared to believe that he had been associated with, married to, related to these wives in the pre-existence. On the other side, we've got at the top, this is from Todd Compton again, quote, the Old Testament, with its prophets and temples and polygamy, is a central thread running through Joseph's life and is clearly a primary source for his sense of prophetic mission and for his doctrine, close quote. Similarly, Richard Bushman writes regarding Joseph Smith in his book, Joseph Smith, Rough Stone Rolling, he writes, quote, he, Joseph Smith, understood plural marriage as a religious principle. And when we think about trying to work out why Joseph Smith introduced plural marriage, obviously, as we've looked at, he has said that he received commands to do it and revelation to do it. We need to bear in mind the context, because he will have been aware of the teachings, perhaps, of people like St. Augustine. He thought that Old Testament plural marriage was a sacrament that symbolized the day when churches in every nation would be subject to Christ. So Augustine of Hippo, he's also known as St. Augustine, he was a theologian, philosopher, bishop of Hippo Regius in Numidia, Roman North Africa, from 354 AD through to 430 AD. Other reasons put forward for plural marriage: raise up seed to God, form links to other families, cohere society, ease financial hardship, increased blessings in the next life, this is one from Wilson Pratt in 1853. He put forward the idea that it would reduce prostitution and adultery. And Brigham Young, he put forward the reason, well, a reason, amongst many perhaps, was that it was a health benefit, because it was his contention that the children from plural marriages were healthier than children from monogamous marriages. Here's a difficult question that comes up. Was Joseph Smith a paedophile? This term is used by typically fairly sort of vigorous critics of the church. I did some research in 2023 online, and 111 people were kind enough to answer the question as to why they had left the church. And I asked a series of questions. One of the questions was, what words would you now use to describe Joseph Smith? Bear in mind, these are folks who have left the church. 23 used the word paedophile, spelt that way, and 8 used the word paedophile, spelled the other way. A total of 31 used that word to describe Joseph Smith. A further 18 used the word predator to describe Joseph Smith. So you can see very strong feelings from some people who have left the church. Is this a fair question to ask? Was Joseph Smith a paedophile? Probably not, because in the 21st century it would certainly be a fair question, but in 200 years ago, it wasn't really a word that was in use at all. It came into use later. And the context does need to be borne in mind in all aspects of understanding the past. The context then needs to be borne in mind. And so borrowing from English common law traditions, American law during the 1840s set the legal age for marriage at 12 for females and 14 for males. This is from Governing the Hearth, Law and Family in the 19th Century America, Michael Grossberg. And paedophilia is a psychiatric disorder in which an adult or older adolescent experiences a primary or exclusive sexual attraction to prepubescent children. Although girls typically begin the process of puberty at age 10 or 11 and boys at age 11 or 12, criteria for paedophilia extend the cutoff point for prepubescence to age 13. A person must be at least 16 years old and at least 5 years older than the prepubescent child for the attraction to be diagnosed as paedophilia. So technically speaking, he wasn't. But obviously, feelings run very high on this matter, and so there are always going to be polar opposite views. Some will use the term. I think they probably use it incorrectly, but I understand why they use it, and others would be horrified and are horrified to even consider the term because of their understanding of what happened with regard to plural marriage and Joseph Smith. Did plural marriages include sexual relations? Well, the answer to the question simply is, in some cases, yes, it did. Brian and Laura Hales have done a great deal of work on this particular subject. This is a table taken from their website. It lists the plural wives that they do believe sexual relations would have taken place. They think there's very strong evidence they think that there is strong evidence for 3, moderate for 5, weak for 2, and they believe that there is little or no evidence for the balance of plural wives. But in answer to that question, in some cases, it appears to have taken place. And Todd Compton adds from his book, quote, in a significant number of marriages, there is evidence for sexual relations. What is the connection between adoption and plural marriage? It's a very interesting question, and I think it's a significant sort of sidebar issue that does obviously need to be taken into account. Again, quoting from Todd Compton's book, quote, "The importance of the size of one's eternal family and the necessity of building it up on this earth is shown by the custom of adoption practiced in the late Nauvoo period by Brigham Young and other Mormon leaders who would have grown men sealed to them as sons. These sons even signed their names with their new father's last name. In the late Nauvoo period, Mormon leaders reportedly competed to add new members, sons, to their adoptive families," close quote. It's difficult to know how widely known this practice is. I was unaware of it until about sort of 10, 15 years ago. It does speak to perhaps an understanding that Joseph Smith had, which he never really spoke about, and there's no written record of, but it appears that it goes to relationality or dynastic connections and sealings together. It's the linking together of God's children at a sort of macro level, where every family is ultimately linked together and sealed together. And in the early days in Nauvoo, it began to be taught. And so men were sealed to other men, typically the main leaders of the church: Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, Wilford Woodruff, Orson Pratt, and others. Many of them had men sealed to them. There is no, as far as I can tell, there is no written record that they were sealed to Joseph Smith, but it is certain that he introduced the idea, and others were sealed to Joseph Smith, other men were sealed to Joseph Smith after Joseph Smith's death. Remember, Joseph Smith was murdered in 1844. In 1846, the record shows that Brigham Young was sealed to Joseph Smith. So how significant is this? What is the connection between that and plural marriage? It's difficult to say with great certainty, but I think it would, in my opinion, be a mistake to disregard the principle of adoption, men to men, sealing men to men. It would be a mistake to disregard that when you come to consider all of the aspects of plural marriage and you try to figure out, what happened, when it happened, why it happened. It would be a mistake to ignore the principle of adoption that took place. How many people practice plural marriage? The exact percentage of Latter-day Saints who participated in the practice is not known, but studies suggest a maximum from 20% to 25% of LDS adults were members of polygamous households. At its height, plural marriage probably involved only a third of the women reaching marriageable age. That's taken from Encyclopedia of Mormonism. At its peak, this is from the Gospel Topics essay on the church's website, at its peak in 1857, perhaps one half of all Utah Latter-day Saints experienced plural marriage, either as a husband, wife, or child. The percentage of those involved in plural marriages steadily declined over the next 3 decades. How many people were prosecuted for practicing plural marriage? More than 2,000 saints had been charged for polygamy, unlawful cohabitation, or other conduct associated with plural marriage. Around 930 of them had gone to prison for their convictions. Belle Harris, a grandniece of Martin Harris, who refused to testify against her husband, had been sent to prison while nursing her infant son. For many saints, such outrages were sacrifices they had been willing to make as followers of Christ. This is taken from the Saints, Volume 2, which is on the church's website. How, when, and why did the church cease practicing plural marriage? Well, here the United States government comes into play. The Republican Party in 1856 had one of its strap lines for recruitment was linking polygamy and slavery in their platform as, quote, the twin relics of barbarism. The Moral Anti-Bigamy Act was introduced in 1862, signed into law by US President Abraham Lincoln, and that prohibited plural marriage in the territories. Remember, Utah was a territory at the time. Upheld by the Supreme Court in 1879. The Edmunds Act in 1882 increased the penalties, and so that increased the pressure and the difficulties upon the church, its leaders, and upon all those who were practicing plural marriage. The Edmunds-Tucker Act in 1887 allowed for the disincorporation of the church and the seizure of church property over the value of $50,000. Initially, the temple lot was excluded on religious grounds. However, in May 1890, the Supreme Court upholds the Edmunds-Tucker Act. And so in 1890, that leads Wilford Woodruff, pictured at the top, who was the president of the church at the time, that leads him to issue the manifesto, which is banning plural marriage. It's banning further sealings of plural marriage. It didn't ban existing plural marriages, and so people continue to live in their plural marriage situations. But it was intended to stop further sealings taking place. It apparently didn't stop there. And as Utah received its statehood in 1896, it then behooved Joseph F. Smith in the middle. He issued the second manifesto in 1904. Ongoing plural marriage sealings had ceased. However, it didn't really come to its total conclusion until the death of President Heber J. Grant, who had 3 plural wives. And when he passed away in 1945, it came to a definite conclusion. What is the legacy of plural marriage? And this is still a very triggering issue for many people, not only women, but also for men too, but primarily for women. And somebody who has been advocating for the church to address some of the issues that are considered to be legacies of the practice of plural marriage is Carolyn Pearson. She wrote a book in 2016 called The Ghost of Eternal Polygamy. It was centered around research that she had done. She got a very large response to a survey that she conducted online in March 2014, 8,000 responses, 70% female, 30% male, 91% current members, 9% former members, 51% of the members were very active, and 93% of the active members held current temple recommends. And this book contains quotes from many people, women and men, primarily women, and about how the principle and practice of plural marriage, although it ceased in 1890 and beyond, it still has upon them, and the effects it still has upon them. And Pearson writes movingly of her hope that in the future the church will, as it did with the race and priesthood issue, as it did with race and priesthood, issue a similar declaration, such as, and she helpfully suggests some words that the church could employ if they were minded to do so. Quote, "Today, the church disavows the theories and practices advanced in the past that a polygamous marriage is essential or advantageous for the highest level of exaltation." A couple of quotes on the right-hand side taken from her book. "I live in constant fear that I will die before my husband and he will be sealed to a second wife, meaning I will live in a polygamous relationship for eternity. I've told him if this happens, I will choose hell over heaven, and he believes me. This is hard on our marriage," close quote. And then second quotation, "A nice Mormon guy hung up the phone when he found I was a sealed widow. He said, 'Why would I want to love someone in this life and then turn her over to her first husband for eternity, along with the children that came from my very own DNA and now belong to him?'" Well, these are viewpoints that are strongly held by many of the people that Carolyn Pearson includes in her book that came from the research that she did in 2016. By way of balance, it would be prudent to say that not everybody is going to agree with some of the analysis that is found in Carolyn Pearson's book. So are there counter-arguments, excuse me, to the ghost of eternal polygamy, which is referred to here as GEP? So yes, there are. GEP reflects the idea that polygamy is required for exaltation or to live in the celestial kingdom. And this is from Brian Hales, and he quotes from GEP. He says, "Polygamy is waiting on the other side to greet us in heaven and causing large injury here on earth. Many women suffer excruciating pain under the long-taught assumption that if they and their husband are sufficiently righteous, they will be expected to live polygamy in the celestial kingdom." And then this is what Brian Hales puts forward as a counterpoint. He says the problem is that no presiding church leader has ever declared that plural marriage is required for exaltation for all people, irrespective of when and where they lived on earth. The belief that every man will be required to practice polygamy in the future, or that every woman will have to share her husband in eternity, is not only doctrinally unsupported, but also mathematically perplexing. It is not and never has been a doctrine of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So that's Brian Hales' view on the subject, put forward as a counterpoint. He also says, quote, "Any fears associated with eternal polygamy are based upon assumptions that we cannot test for validity. To fear eternal polygamy is fearing future circumstances that we cannot accurately describe or even know to exist," close quote. And in my opinion, the legacy is very significant and causes huge concern to many people, much pain in many circumstances. When you read through Carol Lynn Pearson's book. It is pretty heart-rending at different times, and it's a painful read in some cases. Now, whether you agree with Brian Hales that the problem is that no one is declaring what comes across in the Ghost of Eternal Polygamy, Carol Lynn Pearson. Whether you agree with that or not is entirely obviously a matter for each of us to reach our own conclusions from. That brings me to the end of this presentation. If it has sort of bred other questions that haven't been answered, please put them in the comments, and any other comments that you'd like to make, please put them in the comments below, or send them on an email to chiq1830@gmail.com. Thanks again for your time on this, and look forward to speaking with you again on the next one. Thanks very much.